the Earth still holds places so difficult to reach. They barely feel part of our world at all. Far below the Black Sea, ships rest in silence exactly where they vanished. Preserved so perfectly, it is as if time itself refused to touch them. High in the cliffs of Tibet, ancient caves cling to the mountainside in places no civilization should have been able to build. Across the plains of Namibia, perfect circles mark the ground in patterns too precise to ignore, as if the land has been arranged by something unseen. And deep beneath the surface, caves like Krubera descend so far into darkness that even now, explorers have not reached every passage. Then there are the strange pipe-like formations of Baigong, embedded in rock, stretching toward a salt lake, raising a question no one has been able to answer with certainty. These places are real. They have been photographed, studied, debated. And yet, the deeper researchers look, the less complete the picture becomes. Some are lost to depth, some to altitude, some to time, and some remain unexplained for a far more unsettling reason. Because even now, no one can say for certain what they truly are. So settle in, because the world is still filled with places that resist explanation. And the farther we go from the known, the stranger the map becomes. Let's begin. Not all places keep their histories above the waterline. Some mysteries don't haunt you with voices in abandoned hallways or footprints in dust. Some haunt you with silence, thick, heavy silence, preserved the way a photograph preserves a face. Because while the sea is famous for erasing evidence, there is one body of water that does something stranger. It keeps it. The Black Sea, dark, enclosed, and deceptively calm in places, holds a secret that feels almost unfair. In its deeper layers, oxygen thins until life itself retreats. And where there is no oxygen, there are fewer scavengers, fewer bacteria, fewer of the tiny, invisible mouths that normally chew history into fragments. Wood doesn't rot the way it should. Rope can linger. Carvings stay sharp. Hull planks remain aligned like ribs. Down there, ships don't just wreck. They are archived. For centuries, sailors and merchants crossed the Black Sea like it was a corridor between worlds, between empires, between religions, between languages that had never shared an alphabet. Greek colonies and Scythian shores, Byzantine harbors and Genoese trading posts, Ottoman routes and Cossack raids. Later, steam and steel, wars and blockades, mines and torpedoes. It is one of the most trafficked and contested seas in human history. And yet, when modern explorers began lowering cameras into its depths, when sonar started tracing shapes where no diver could safely linger, they found something that didn't feel like a random scattering of accidents. They found a graveyard, not just a few wrecks, not a handful, dozens, then hundreds. Then the unsettling realization that the seafloor here may hold an uncountable fleet, layers of ships resting in darkness like pages stacked in a closed book. Some broken, yes. Some torn apart by storms or war, but others astonishingly intact. Standing masts, rudders still attached, amphorae still nested where they fell. The kind of preservation that makes time feel less like a river and more like a locked room. You are there in the first quiet minutes when the screen stops looking like noise and starts looking like a place. You sit close to the monitors, the room dim so the glare doesn't wash out the details. On the feed, the ROV's lights cut a narrow tunnel through black water that seems thick, almost textured, like velvet pulled tight. Particles drift by, slow snow in a world with no wind. The altitude numbers tick downward, steady and patient, and the only sound you hear is equipment hum and the occasional clipped voice calling out readings. Then the bottom resolves, not as sand, but as an edge, an angle that shouldn't be there. The beam slides forward and the shape becomes unmistakable. Timbers set in order, a curve of hull, a line that reads as intention, not geology. The light climbs and a mast rises into frame, standing upright in the dark, as if it never accepted it had fallen. You don't feel like you're discovering a wreck. You feel like you're interrupting something that has been waiting, perfectly preserved, long enough to forget what the surface looks like. The reason begins with the Black Sea itself, a sea with a body and a shadow. At the surface, it behaves like any other. Waves, currents, oxygen, life. But beneath, it becomes a different environment, dense, stratified, and reluctant to mix. Fresher river water flows in from Europe. Saltier water creeps in from the Mediterranean through narrow passages. The layers resist each other like oil and water. Over time, the deep becomes isolated, sealed away from replenishing oxygen. In that sealed darkness, hydrogen sulfide accumulates, an invisible warning that this is not a place meant for lungs or for most organisms. And so, the deep Black Sea becomes a preservation chamber for anything that sinks past a certain depth. A ship that would be reduced to a skeleton elsewhere can remain here like a sleeping animal, its joints still in place. That scientific fact alone is eerie enough. But the deeper mystery, the one that makes this place feel cursed rather than merely unique, is the pattern of loss, the sense of absence in the records. Because if the Black Sea preserves ships so well, then why do so many of them feel like surprises? Why do entire classes of vessels, merchantmen, warships, coastal craft, appear on the seafloor without the kind of detailed paper trail we'd expect from the civilizations that depended on them? If a ship sinks in most seas, its remains dissolve into sand and rumour. In the Black Sea, it can remain as physical proof, and physical proof raises uncomfortable questions. There is something disturbing about looking at an intact wreck and realizing that the people who built it might still be a mystery. In many cases, the explanation is simple. Records don't survive the way wood does down there. Fires, invasions, political collapse, deliberate destruction. Paper is fragile, and archives can be erased in an afternoon. Coastal towns are sacked, libraries burned, languages die, and bureaucracy dissolves into myth. A ship can sink on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the empire that owned it is arguing about succession instead of salvage. But that explanation doesn't cover everything, because the Black Sea has always been a place where ships vanished not only from history, but from certainty. It is a sea of sudden weather, storms that build with little warning. A sea ringed by mountains and steep coasts where winds can funnel and accelerate. A sea of narrow straits, tricky currents, shifting sandbars near river deltas. And in earlier eras, before reliable charts, before engines, before radios, navigation here could be a slow negotiation with danger. A captain might set out from one harbour with a confident plan and encounter fog that turns the horizon into a blank wall. The coastline becomes unfamiliar. Landmarks vanish. Stars are hidden. The ship drifts. And then the sea does what it always does. It chooses what to return. There are also older dangers that historians mention with almost casual sobriety. Piracy and raiding, so constant in some periods that it became background noise. A ship could be taken quickly, quietly, and without witnesses who lived long enough to testify. cargo stolen, crew enslaved, vessels scuttled to remove evidence. If you were a coastal villager watching from a distant ridge, you might see sails in trouble, and then nothing at all, and the story that reaches the next town will be rumor, storm, bandits, sea monsters, divine punishment, anything except the uncomfortable truth that the sea was not the only predator. And then there is war. The Black Sea has been a theater of conflict for centuries, and modern wars left behind a special kind of wreck, silent, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. Mines don't care about flags. Torpedoes don't leave survivors by design. Convoys disappear into cold water while the paperwork gets classified, lost, or simplified into casualty numbers. A ship can become a statistic before it becomes a grave. And yet, even knowing all that, there is still something uncanny about the Black Sea ship graveyard, because preservation changes the emotional math. When a wreck is reduced to fragments, the imagination fills gaps with drama. When a wreck is intact, the imagination goes quiet. It becomes clinical. It becomes real. You are no longer picturing a myth. You are staring at the exact angle a mast broke, the way planks splayed outward, the way cargo spilled and settled. You are seeing the last decision the ship ever made. Some of the most haunting discoveries come from wrecks that look almost peaceful. A merchant vessel lying upright on the seafloor as if it simply chose to stop sailing. The stern still proud. The bow still pointed toward a destination it never reached. The rigging hanging slack like hair in still water. Nothing dramatic, no explosion, no clear violence. Just a ship resting, preserved, and silent. Those are the wrecks that invite the most unsettling question. If it sank so gently, why didn't anyone write down what happened? One possibility is that some of these vessels never had the kind of records we imagine. Not every ship belonged to an empire. Many belonged to merchants who didn't leave memoirs, or to small communities who traded quietly without chroniclers. Some were coastal craft running local routes, grain, wine, timber, fish. Voyages too ordinary to be recorded unless something went spectacularly wrong. But spectacularly wrong is exactly what seems to have happened, again and again, across centuries. And here the Black Sea becomes a mirror for the limits of history itself. We tend to believe that the past is a story with a narrator, that someone, somewhere, was writing it down. But the Black Sea wrecks implies something colder. Much of human movement was undocumented. Much of commerce happened in the shadows of larger events. Much of death occurred without witnesses that mattered to history. The sea preserves the ship, but it does not preserve the name. There is also the geographic cruelty of the Black Sea. Its shores include some of the richest river mouths in Europe, places where sediment builds hidden shoals and shifting channels. A ship might survive the open water and then be betrayed by the coastline itself, grounded and broken by waves. If the crew made it to shore, they might have been absorbed into local life, or killed, or taken, or simply never found. If they didn't, then the sea kept them too. And the ship, down in the anoxic layers, remained, waiting for a technology that would not exist for 1,000 years. When modern expeditions began revealing these wrecks, they weren't just discovering shipwrecks. They were discovering the gap between what we think we know and what actually happened. Because every intact hull is an accusation against the completeness of our narratives. And then there's the question that sits like a stone at the bottom of this mystery. What remains unlogged? Even now, we have not mapped the Black Sea completely. Sonar surveys cover pieces. Expeditions focus on specific areas. The sea floor is vast, and the deep is hostile. There are political boundaries, restricted zones, costs that climb into the millions. Technology has improved, but time and funding are still finite. So what happens if the ship graveyard is not a collection of known wrecks, but a fraction? What if there are clusters of ships where we don't expect them, piled like dominoes in a trench, or scattered like a dropped handful of coins along a forgotten route? What if there are wrecks that don't match any known design? Odd hull shapes, unfamiliar construction, evidence of shipbuilding traditions not well documented. And what if some are not ancient at all? The Black Sea has seen modern tragedies. Ships sunk in wartime, submarines lost, vessels that vanished during political upheaval. Not all losses become public knowledge. Not all wreck sites are shared. Not all data is released when it touches on national security, or sensitive history, or disputed narratives. A wreck can be preserved not only by chemistry, but by secrecy. That's where the ship graveyard begins to feel less like an archaeological wonder and more like a locked archive. A place that keeps what falls into it, while the living argue about what should be seen. Even the science itself adds a strange layer of unease. Anoxic preservation sounds like a gift, like a miracle for historians. But it's also a reminder that the deep Black Sea is, in a sense, dead. A vast zone where normal cycles of life do not operate, where decay is delayed, where time behaves differently. And when time behaves differently, objects stop feeling like the past. They start feeling like the present, trapped. Imagine a ship that sank in the medieval period, its crew lost, its cargo spilled. Yet its structure still resembles something you might see in a museum reconstruction. Except this is not reconstructed. This is original. This is the actual thing, in situ, untouched by oxygen, untouched by waves, untouched by curious hands for centuries. It's the closest we get to a time capsule that nobody meant to make. And time capsules carry an expectation that someone will open them and understand. But understanding is not guaranteed, because a ship can be intact and still refuse to tell you why it died. Was it caught in a storm? Struck by a hidden reef? Lost to a navigational miscalculation? Taken by raiders and scuttled? Overloaded, poorly maintained, leaking slowly until buoyancy failed? Or did something more complex happen? Conflict on board, disease, sabotage, events that leave no obvious trace on timber? Sometimes the sea is not dramatic. Sometimes it is merely final. And there is another, quieter theory that lives beneath the obvious ones. That the Black Sea's ship graveyard reflects not only danger, but dependency. That so many ships sailed here, so frequently, for so many centuries, that even normal rates of loss would accumulate into something that looks extraordinary. If thousands of voyages happen every year, even a small percentage of failure becomes a steady rain of wrecks. Over time, the seafloor becomes a ledger, not of mystery, but of mathematics. Yet even that sober explanation can't completely settle the mind, because the pattern still feels too human, too loaded, too full of stories that were never written down. And the deeper you think about it, the more the Black Sea begins to resemble a second history, one that exists beneath the official one. A history of commerce without chronicles, of migration without names, of war without memorials, of mistakes that never became lessons because no one survived to teach them. A history built out of wood and iron instead of ink. So when you hear ship graveyard, don't picture a few famous wrecks with plaques and dive tours. Picture a silent plain in darkness, where ships from different centuries rest within miles of each other. A Roman-era merchantman not far from a medieval trader. a 19th century steamer lying beyond them like a newer tombstone. And somewhere farther out, beyond the mapped zones, shapes that have never been identified at all. Not because they're impossible to find, but because no one has looked there yet, or because someone has and didn't tell. In the end, the most unsettling thing about the Black Sea is not that it swallows ships. It's that it refuses to let them disappear. It preserves the evidence, patiently, meticulously, like a collector with infinite shelves. And every time a new wreck is found, intact and quiet, it doesn't feel like closure. It feels like the sea is clearing its throat, as if to say, you've told your history up here, on land, with your borders and your dates and your confident narratives. But down here, I have the versions you forgot. And the longer we explore, the more uncomfortable the question becomes, because it turns back on us, not on the past. If the Black Sea can keep ships intact for millennia, then what else can it keep? What else has fallen into that low oxygen darkness, unrecorded, unclaimed, and waiting, so perfectly preserved that if a camera found it tomorrow, it would look less like an artifact and more like something that was only just lost. Story 2. The Forbidden Caves of Tibet's Sky Burial Cliffs. Not all preservation is cold, wet, and accidental. There are places on Earth where the unknown is kept dry, kept high, kept close to the sky. Places where the landscape itself becomes a vault, and the door is not locked with iron, but with altitude, thin air, and a kind of reverence that makes outsiders lower their voices without being told. In the Himalayas, along remote Tibetan valleys and cliff faces that seem too steep to belong to the human world, there are caves, thousands of them, cut like dark pores into pale stone. Some are low and reachable, like shallow mouths. Others are stacked in vertical constellations, rows and clusters scattered across sheer rock walls, so high and so exposed that from the valley floor, they look less like architecture and more like a strange natural pattern, like something the mountain grew. To stand beneath them is to feel a quiet vertigo. The cliffs rise and rise and rise again until they narrow into snow and cloud. Wind combs the slopes with a steady, indifferent sound. Ravens and vultures wheel on thermals you can't see, drawing slow circles that seem almost patient. And there, half hidden by shadow, are openings no wider than a doorway, carved into rock that has known ice ages and earthquakes and centuries of prayer. You are there at the base of the wall, where the air is already thin enough to make your breath sound louder than it should. You lift your eyes, and the cliff seems to lean over you, a pale face perforated by darkness. You bring the camera up, or send a drone out into the wind, and the first clean angle snaps into view. Rows of black ovals, some clustered like beehives, some solitary, some so high they sit near the color of old snow. The screen shows each opening as a hard-edged absence, and the mind keeps trying to turn absence into a room. You watch the shadow inside one cave shift as the angle changes, and for a moment it looks like depth, like a corridor, not just a shallow cut. The wind buffets the signal, the image trembles, and you realize how easy it would be to lose control, how quickly the mountain could swallow the machine the way it swallows footsteps. Down in the valley, everything feels exposed. Up there, the cliff has been hiding doors in plain sight. These are often called the forbidden caves of Tibet's sky burial cliffs. Not forbidden in the sense of a posted sign or a fenced boundary, but forbidden in the old way, by remoteness, by danger, and by the delicate line between curiosity and violation. Because nearby, in many regions of the Tibetan Plateau and Himalayan cultural sphere, there exists a funeral practice that feels startling to those raised elsewhere. Sky burial. A ritual shaped by the realities of high altitude, thin soil, scarce fuel for cremation, long winters, and by a spiritual worldview that treats the body as a temporary vessel. When life ends, what remains is not the person. The flesh is offered back into the cycle, carried away by birds into the open sky. It is a practice that makes the landscape part of the ceremony. The cliffs become an altar, the wind a witness, the birds the final movement of the rite. And where there are sky burials, there are often places associated with them. Platforms, charnel grounds, secluded slopes where the living do what they must and then leave. So when travelers and researchers first began to notice these cliffside caves, especially the ones clustered near areas known for burial customs, the mind reached for an obvious conclusion. Caves near death rites must be part of those rites. Caves above charnel grounds must hold bones, relics, offerings, remnants of what the birds did not take. It seems neat and it seems logical. But the Himalayas are not neat. And the deeper you look at these cave networks, the more they resist any single explanation. Some are clearly practical. Simple shelters, places to store grain or tools, temporary refuges from storms. But many are not simple at all. Some caves extend inward into chambers and branching corridors. Some show soot stains that suggest fires burned long ago. Some contain wall niches, as if for lamps or small objects. In certain regions of the broader Himalayan plateau, especially in places historically linked to Tibet's Western and Trans-Himalayan worlds, archaeologists have found cave burials and cave complexes with human remains, textiles, tools, and signs of long habitation. And then there are the caves no one can easily reach. These are the ones that change the story. Openings suspended on vertical rock faces, accessible only by climbing gear today, and in the past, if they were accessed at all, by methods that would have required ropes, ladders, or pathways now gone. Some sit so high above the valley that even a skilled climber would think twice. And when you try to imagine an ancient community hauling bodies, supplies, offerings, or even daily necessities up to those heights, you run into a practical question that feels almost rude to ask in such a sacred context. Why would anyone do this? One answer is that the caves were not meant for daily life, but for something that demanded separation. A body placed in an elevated cave is removed from scavengers, removed from flood, removed from casual disturbance. In a region where open-air exposure is part of ritual, there may also be reasons to keep certain remains, important lamas, revered practitioners, individuals whose bones are considered relics, from being scattered. Not every death is treated the same way. Not every body is offered to the sky. In Tibetan Buddhist traditions, relics can matter. Bones, ash, fragments, physical traces associated with spiritual attainment can become objects of veneration. If a cave held such remains, it would not be a simple grave. It would be a hidden shrine. But that theory collides with another reality. Many of these caves are not reverent chambers. Some are cramped, utilitarian. Some show evidence of repeated use, as if many different people were there at different times. Some seem less like sanctuaries and more like storehouses. And some according to accounts from explorers and locals, contain nothing at all. Empty rock rooms with no obvious purpose, like abandoned ideas carved into stone. So another theory takes over, one that has nothing to do with burial and everything to do with fear. The Himalayas have always been a frontier. Kingdoms rose and fell in valleys where a single pass could decide trade routes and invasions. Armies moved through narrow corridors of stone. Caravans carried salt, wool, tea, and precious metals. And along those routes were raids, feuds, taxes, and sudden violence, forces that can make a home feel temporary. In such a world, caves are not just spiritual spaces, they are hiding places. A cliffside cave, high and hard to reach, is an excellent refuge. You can see the valley approach. You can retreat upward. You can store food and valuables. You can wait out a threat. And if the entrance is small, it is easier to defend. Across many mountainous regions of the world, people have used caves and cliff dwellings this way, turning geology into security. But that too raises questions. If these were refuges, why so many? Why in such dense clusters? Why carve hundreds of openings into a single cliff face? Unless the cliff itself was not just a refuge, but a settlement. Imagine a valley where the safe, flat ground is scarce, where the threat of raids is constant, where winter storms make open structures vulnerable. In such conditions, a community might expand into the cliff like termites into wood, carving room after room as generations pass. Storage here, sleeping space there, a shrine in the deeper chamber, a concealed niche for valuables behind a wall of stone. And yet, the moment you picture it, you also feel how unnatural it seems. These cliffs are not gentle. They are brutal plains of rock. To carve into them at scale requires time, skill, and a reason strong enough to justify the risk. Which leads to the third possibility, the one that makes these caves feel truly forbidden, not by law, but by their relationship to practice. Because in Tibetan history, there is a long tradition of retreat. Not the casual retreat of vacation or solitude, but the intense, disciplined withdrawal of spiritual practitioners who leave society to pursue meditation, ritual, and transformation in isolation. Hermitages cling to mountainsides. Small cells are built where the only companion is wind. In some lineages, practitioners seek out remote caves specifically, places where the sensory world becomes quiet enough that the mind has nowhere to hide from itself. A cave is perfect for this. It is narrow. It is still. It forces attention inward. In the high Himalayas, legends speak of masters meditating for years in caves, emerging changed, thin as shadows, eyes bright, speech minimal, as if the mountain rewrote them. Some sites are associated with famous figures and sacred narratives, and caves become part of the spiritual geography. Points on a map not of nations, but of meaning. So perhaps some of these cliff caves were meditation cells. Perhaps the unreachable openings weren't meant for common access, but for those willing to risk everything to reach solitude. Perhaps the height itself was part of the discipline, an added barrier to casual intrusion. But even that doesn't fit the sheer number. A handful of retreat caves makes sense. Thousands begins to feel like something else. And then we arrive at the uncomfortable thought that what we are looking at is not one history, but layered histories. A cliff that served as refuge in one century could become a spiritual site in another. A cave used for storage could later become a burial chamber. A retreat cell could later be repurposed as a hiding place, or sealed as taboo, or simply forgotten when trade routes shifted and valleys emptied. In places like this, the mountain becomes a kind of archive, but not an organized one. More like a shelf where different generations keep stuffing their secrets until no one remembers which secret belongs to which era. That's what makes the caves so difficult for science to explain in the satisfying way we crave. It's not that there's no plausible purpose, it's that there are too many plausible purposes, and the evidence is scattered, incomplete, and hard to reach. Even the act of reaching them changes what you can know. High-altitude exploration is not like exploring a ruin in a forest. You don't stroll into these caves with a notebook and a camera. You climb, you anchor ropes, you fight wind that tries to peel you off the rock. You operate in thin air that punishes every movement. The caves themselves may be choked with rubble, their floors unstable, their ceilings fractured by freeze-thaw cycles. And the moment you step inside, the light drops away and the temperature changes, as if you've crossed into a different season. In that darkness, it becomes easy to understand why stories grow around these places. Because the mind hates an opening it can't interpret. Locals may know certain caves by name and warn against others. Some may be associated with spirits, with old rituals, with things that should not be disturbed. In Tibetan and Himalayan folklore, the landscape is alive with unseen presences, protective deities, territorial spirits, forces that are not evil in the modern cinematic sense, but simply powerful and easily offended by ignorance. A cave, in that worldview, is not empty even when it contains nothing. It is a threshold, and thresholds collect rules. Don't go at night. Don't speak loudly. Don't point. Don't take what you find. Don't enter without a reason. Don't enter at all. From the outside, such warnings can sound like superstition. But in harsh landscapes, superstition often functions as safety. A taboo keeps people away from places where accidents happen. A story keeps children from climbing cliffs. A spirit becomes a way of naming a danger that has no simple explanation. Yet sometimes, just sometimes, taboos form around something real. A burial cave disturbed, a sacred object removed, a tragedy that no one wants repeated. And that is where the forbidden part begins to feel less like a label and more like an atmosphere. Because when you look up at those openings, you are looking at a network of spaces we can't easily inventory, can't easily excavate, can't easily protect. Inaccessible caves don't just resist modern science, they resist modern accountability. If there are artifacts, they may never be catalogued. If there are remains, they may never be respectfully studied. If there are paintings or texts, they may fade before anyone knows they existed. A cliff can hide loss in plain sight. And there is another layer, one that whispers behind all the others. The Himalayas have not only been a spiritual frontier, they have been a political one. Borders shifted, powers competed. Monasteries were sometimes protected, sometimes targeted. In times of upheaval, people hide what they can. Religious objects, manuscripts, valuables, even evidence. Anything that might be confiscated or destroyed. If you had a sacred text you believed must survive at any cost, where would you put it? Not in your home, not in a monastery that could be raided. You would put it somewhere the mountain itself guards, somewhere that requires knowledge, strength, and commitment to retrieve, somewhere most pursuers would not bother to search. A high cave tucked into a cliff face begins to look less like a mystery and more like a strategy. This is where fringe theories begin to gather, quietly like snowdrifts. Stories of hidden libraries, sealed chambers of forbidden teachings, treasure caches from lost kingdoms, evidence of vanished peoples, even rumors of tunnels that connect cave systems across ridges as if the mountain contains a hidden city. Most of these claims are impossible to verify, and many are likely exaggerations born from a simple fact. There are too many caves to account for, and too little access to prove what's inside them. But the longing behind the rumors is understandable, because caves are one of humanity's oldest containers of meaning. They hold burials, paintings, prayers, secrets, contraband, memories. They hold what we want to keep away from weather and enemies and time. And the Tibetan sky burial cliffs, whether they were carved for the dead, for the living, or for something in between, feel like a place where that impulse was taken to an extreme. Not just hidden, but elevated, placed closer to the sky, as if distance from the ground could distance you from everything that follows. Even the birds make sense in that frame. Vultures are often seen as grim in other cultures. Here, they are part of the sacred machinery of return. They are also watchers, patient, circling, always present. Their flight lines trace invisible routes between cliff caves and open air, between stone and sky. They move with the confidence of creatures that have done this for centuries. And there's a strange, haunting symmetry in that. In the Black Sea, preservation happens because oxygen is missing. Down there, decay is slowed, and the past is held intact, waiting for a camera to expose it. Up here, the air is everywhere, wind, sunlight, open sky, and yet the caves still keep their secrets. Not by preventing decay, but by preventing access. Not by freezing time, but by simply refusing us entry. 2 vaults, 2 kinds of silence. And perhaps the most unsettling idea is that both kinds of silence can coexist with human presence. People walked the decks of those preserved ships. People carved these cave mouths into cliffs. People climbed, carried, chiseled, prayed, hid, and buried. The difference is not whether humans were here. The difference is whether we can reconstruct what they meant. Because meaning does not preserve the way wood does. Meaning does not fossilize neatly. It erodes, it migrates, it gets repurposed. A cave that once held bones may later hold grain. A cave that once held prayer may later hold weapons. A cave that once held a man in meditation may later be sealed because someone died there, and no one wants to risk it again. And now, in the modern era, we stand at the base of these cliffs with cameras and drones and questions, and the caves look back at us like blank eyes. We want a single answer: burial caves, ritual caves, hiding places, lost monasteries, secret tunnels. But the mountain offers something harder: a layered archive where different centuries wrote over each other, and where the most important details may be trapped behind a meter of collapsed rock, or a narrow opening too high for anyone to reach safely, or a local rule that says you are not supposed to be there. So the forbidden caves remain, above the valleys, above the roads, above the reach of easy explanation. They watch the seasons change. They listen to avalanches in the distance. They feel the tremor of earthquakes that never make the news. They hold emptiness, and bones, and soot, and air that has not moved in a long time. And somewhere in that long chain of openings, some chamber that no modern light has touched, something might still be waiting. Not necessarily treasure, not necessarily proof of a lost civilization. Just a small, quiet clue, a bundle of cloth, a niche with a relic, a smear of pigment on stone, a handprint, a line of writing, a single object placed there with intention, meant to outlast a lifetime. Because that is what people do when they sense the world is unstable. They put something somewhere safe, and they trust the landscape to remember what humans might forget. And the Himalayas, older than our languages, older than our borders, have been remembering for a very long time. The question is whether they ever intended to give those memories back, or whether, like the Black Sea, they simply keep what falls into their custody, until the day someone looks into the darkness and realizes the past isn't gone at all. It's just out of reach. Story 3. The Namibian fairy circles. Not all mysteries cling to cliffs. Some drift down from the high places and settle where the world feels flatter, quieter, almost indifferent. After the sky burial caves, after the sense that the Himalayas hold their secrets like closed hands, we move to a landscape that does the opposite. A place that exposes itself completely. No doors, no ledges, no shadows deep enough to hide a chamber. Just open air, a hard sun, and a horizon that seems to stretch until it forgets your name. And yet, even here, something has been arranging the ground. In the grasslands of Namibia, far from the tourist postcards of dunes and skeleton coast shipwrecks, the earth wears a strange pattern, one that looks, at first glance, like deliberate design. Perfectly round circles, bare of vegetation, scattered across the plain in a vast constellation. Some are small enough to step across, others are wide enough to park a truck inside. They repeat again and again, across miles, as if the land has been stamped with an invisible seal. From above, it becomes more unsettling. The circles don't just appear randomly. They hold their distance from one another, almost as if they know where their neighbors are. They spread across the landscape in spacing that feels measured, not accidental, like the spacing of stones in a ruin, or the spacing of stars in a careful diagram. You are staring at the image on a screen, but your body doesn't believe it's a photograph yet. You zoom in, then out, and the circles stay perfectly round, each one a clean omission in the grass. The more you widen the view, the worse it gets, because the pattern refuses to break. It just keeps going, mile after mile, circles repeating at careful distances, as if something set rules for where grass is allowed to live. Your cursor drifts over one, then another, measuring nothing, proving nothing, only tracing the edges, following the boundary where green abruptly turns to bare earth. You lean closer, searching for a road, a fence line, a burn scar, anything human that would make the geometry make sense. But the plain offers no signature, no single center, no obvious origin. Just a field that looks like it has been edited, like someone erased perfect discs from the land and left the rest untouched. And in that quiet moment, before any theory arrives to soften it, you feel the oldest reaction of all. Not fear exactly, something more primitive. The sense that you've discovered a pattern that was never meant to be noticed from the ground. They are called the Namibian fairy circles. And the name is not just poetic, it is an admission, because no one agrees on what makes them. For decades, the circles have been a quiet argument between explanations that are almost too ordinary and patterns that seem too precise. They are, in a sense, the opposite of the Himalayan caves. In Tibet, the mystery hides behind height and danger. In Namibia, the mystery lies in plain sight and still refuses to give itself up. The circles appear in regions where rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, where the grass survives by chance as much as by biology. When the rains come, the plain can briefly turn soft and green, as if it has forgiven the dryness. The circles too can seem to soften at the edges, but the bare centers persist. Often, they are ringed by taller grass, lush compared to the surrounding field, like a halo fed by something the center cannot access. That detail matters, because it suggests the circles are not simply dead spots. They are part of a system, a redistribution, a decision. Stand on the ground among them, and the effect is subtle at first. It looks like someone cleared a patch to camp, or burned a small fire, or dug something out. But then you walk, and another circle appears, and another, and you begin to sense that you're inside a pattern too large to understand from within. The circles can stretch in every direction, each one a quiet emission in the grass, an absence with a boundary. The first thing most people want is a single cause, a culprit, a tidy origin story. But fairy circles don't offer tidy stories. They offer competing ones. One of the oldest and most persistent explanations involves termites. In parts of Namibia, harvester termites live beneath the soil in organized colonies. They forage for plant material, they move through hidden tunnels, and they survive by managing a harsh environment with ruthless efficiency. Some researchers argue that termites clear the vegetation at the center of a circle, either by eating the roots or by altering the soil, creating a bare patch. Once the center is cleared, the water that would have gone to plants there is no longer being used, so it remains in the soil longer. The surrounding grasses on the ring benefit. They grow taller. They look healthier. The circle becomes stable, a dry land irrigation system designed by insects. It's an explanation that feels almost satisfying because it's so grounded. No magic, no mystery, just ecology. And there is evidence in some places, termite activity, termite galleries, signs of life beneath the circles. But the argument doesn't end there, because other researchers have observed circles where termites are absent, or where termite presence seems too inconsistent to be the sole cause. And in a mystery like this, inconsistency is the crack that theories fall into. Another idea shifts the focus away from insects and toward plants themselves, toward the possibility that the grass is not merely a victim of the circles, but an architect. In arid landscapes, plants compete intensely for water. Their roots spread outward, seeking moisture in soil that offers almost none. In some systems, vegetation can self-organize into patterns because of these pressures. Patches of growth here, bare ground there. It's a strange kind of natural geometry, where competition and scarcity create order. In this view, a fairy circle is a result of collective plant behavior, an emergent pattern in which grasses, through root competition and water redistribution, effectively push each other into stable spacing. One patch dies back, another thrives, and the landscape settles into a repeating design that conserves water and stabilizes the system. It's not intelligence in the human sense. It's not decision-making with intention, but it can look like intention from above. The same way snowflakes look designed, and honeycombs look engineered, and river deltas look like branching diagrams. Yet even this doesn't fully soothe the mind, because the circles are not just patterns. They are circles, clean-edged, often remarkably round. And roundness suggests boundaries. Boundaries suggest control. So the theories multiply. Some have proposed that gases rising from below, natural emissions, subtle geochemical processes, could alter the soil in ways that prevent plants from growing in the center. Others have suggested microbial activity, soil hydrology, the particular structure of sand and clay beneath the surface. Some models point to feedback loops, vegetation changes, soil moisture, Soil moisture changes vegetation, and over time, patterns lock into place. Each explanation tries to translate the same visual truth into a mechanism, but the circles keep their silence. Part of what makes them so hypnotic is that they exist on the border between two human instincts, the instinct to explain and the instinct to interpret. If you show a satellite image of fairy circles to someone who has never heard of them, you will often see the same reaction. A pause, a narrowing of the eyes, the quiet sense that you're looking at something made, because humans are pattern readers. We are evolved to detect design, even when design is not present. In a desert, a circle stands out like a word written in the sand. And in Namibia, the circles are so numerous and so consistent in their distribution that they almost feel like a message that has not been decoded. The term fairy circles comes with older stories. Local folklore speaks of spirits, of gods, of the footprints of supernatural beings. In some tellings, they are places where the earth has been touched by something not meant to touch it. In others, they are warnings, areas that must not be disturbed, not because a person will be harmed immediately, but because the land will remember the disturbance. These stories matter, not because they replace science, but because they reveal how the circles behave on the human mind. Even before satellites and ecological models, people saw them and felt the need to narrate them, to assign them agency, to place them in a universe where patterns mean something. And there's another layer, quieter but more unsettling. The circles are not unique to Namibia. Similar circular patches have been observed in other arid regions, particularly in parts of Australia, where bare discs appear in grasslands under similar conditions. The parallels raise an uncomfortable question. If two distant landscapes can produce similar patterns, does that make the phenomenon more explainable or more profound? Because convergent patterns suggest rules, and rules suggest that the environment itself is capable of producing designs that look intentional without intention ever existing. It becomes, in a strange way, philosophical. Fairy circles are not just about termites or grasses. They are about what happens when life meets scarcity. Imagine what the desert asks of a plant. It asks it to survive long stretches of nothing. It asks it to endure heat that steals moisture faster than roots can replace it. It asks it to compete, not in abundance, but in lack. In such a place, chaos can be fatal. Random growth can waste water. Overcrowding can kill everything. So the system adapts. In the termite theory, the adaptation is biological engineering. Termites create reservoirs by clearing centers and concentrating growth on edges, stabilizing water access across a colony's territory. In the self-organization theory, the adaptation is emergent strategy. Plants arrange themselves into patterns that maximize survival across the whole community, not by planning, but by feedback. Either way, the circles become something like a compromise between life and desert, a negotiation written in geometry. But even if we accept that idea, questions still linger, because the circles do not behave like simple scars. Some appear and fade over time. Others seem to persist for decades. Some edges are crisp, while others blur as grasses creep inward. And researchers who track them from above have noticed that the pattern is not frozen. It shifts subtly, like a slow tide of absence. That motion complicates every explanation because it implies dynamics, birth, maturity, decay. It implies that circles are not single events, but processes. And processes invite deeper questions. If termites cause them, why do circles appear where termite evidence is weak? Why do circles maintain such roundness? Why do they form at particular distances from one another? If plants cause them, what triggers the initial die-off at the center? How does the system choose a boundary? Why are circles so clean compared to other vegetation patterns? If gases cause them, why do they repeat in such regular spacing? Why do rings of healthier growth appear at the edges? Each theory can explain parts. Few explain all. And so the fairy circles remain one of those unsettling natural riddles where the world seems to be doing something intelligent, but refuses to prove it. There is a moment that scientists sometimes describe quietly when they work in places like this. It's not a dramatic moment. It's not fear. It's a kind of humility that feels almost physical. You walk out into the field with your instruments. You measure soil moisture. You check root density. You map the circles. You collect samples. You look for termites, for chemical signatures, for anything that will turn the pattern into a mechanism. And then the sun sinks low, and the shadows lengthen across the plain, and the circles begin to look less like data and more like marks, like imprints left behind by something that passed through long ago. The desert does this. It drains noise from the world until even simple shapes feel like messages. And the circles are shapes that the desert keeps repeating. If you step into the center of one, the ground feels ordinary. Sand, dryness, a little crust of soil, no obvious scorch marks, no strange smell rising from below. The absence is almost more disturbing because it is so clean. No evidence of violence, no obvious cause, just refusal. The grass will not grow here. Then you step to the edge, and the grass can be higher, greener, stronger, like a border fed by what the center stores, a ring of life around a disk of emptiness. It resembles a principle more than a phenomenon, a rule written in plants. And as the day heat fades, the wind moves through the grass like a slow breath, and you begin to see the circles not as isolated oddities, but as one continuous network, an invisible system that spans the landscape, connecting each patch of absence to the next through spacing alone. From above, the pattern becomes almost cellular, like the skin of something. Not an animal, not a creature in any familiar sense, but a living landscape behaving like a living organism, distributing resources, controlling growth, maintaining balance. It's the kind of thought that science pushes back against, rightly, because metaphor is not mechanism, because feeling is not evidence. But mysteries like this survive, because the feeling keeps returning, because even when you strip away the folklore, even when you test the soil and count the termites, the visual fact remains. The land is patterned. And in human history, patterns have always been suspicious. They are what we look for when we search for meaning in stars, when we chart lines on maps, when we interpret ruins. Pattern is how we detect intention. It is the signature of mind. So when the earth itself produces patterns that mimic intention, we feel the old reflex awaken, the fear that the world might be speaking in a language we don't understand. Maybe fairy circles are nothing more than ecology doing what ecology does, organizing itself under pressure. Maybe they are proof of how life can shape the ground without consciousness, creating designs that look like art, but are really survival. Or maybe the termite theory is correct, and the circles are the work of tiny architects beneath the soil, building water systems that endure longer than any individual insect. Or maybe the truth is messier, a combination of forces layered together. Insects, roots, moisture, microbes, and time, all writing on the same page until the writing looks deliberate. But the most haunting possibility is not that the circles have a strange cause. It's that they have a familiar one, and yet still make us uneasy. Because if a landscape can generate order without intention, then the boundary between design and accident becomes thinner than we like to admit. And if the desert can do this, if it can stamp a repeating geometry onto its own surface, then how many other patterns are we living inside without recognizing them? How many messages are really just systems? How many systems might still feel like messages when we don't know the rules? In Namibia, the circles wait. They expand and fade. They hold their spacing. They return like an old habit of the land. And every time the rains come and the grass tries again, the circles answer in the same quiet way, by keeping their centers empty, as if the earth is reserving those spaces for something that isn't visible. The Himalayas keep their memories out of reach. The Namib keeps its mystery right under your feet. And when you leave the field, when the last circles vanish behind you and the grass becomes a simple plain again, there is a strange feeling, like you've walked away from a diagram that was meant to be read, a pattern that doesn't chase you, a pattern that doesn't need you, because it was there before anyone named it, and it will likely be there long after we decide, confidently, what it really is. The only question is whether the explanation, when it finally arrives, will make the circles feel ordinary, or whether, even then, the perfect roundness will keep whispering the same unsettling thought, that the land has been arranging itself, and we're still not sure why. Story 4. The depths of the Krubera cave. When you sit with that thought long enough, you begin to notice a pattern in the way mysteries behave. Some of them don't hide by being complicated. They hide by being patient. They don't chase our attention. They wait beneath it. In Namibia, the mystery lies in the open, etched into grassland like a quiet signature. But elsewhere, the unanswered questions don't show themselves at all. They retreat. They descend. They keep slipping away from the reach of sunlight and maps and certainty, because there are places on Earth that are not content to be merely remote. They are built to be unreachable, and one of them begins not with a dramatic entrance, but with a hole in a mountainside, a cold breath from the ground, a dark mouth in limestone, a place locals once called Voronya, the crow's cave, as if the birds themselves had named it for the way it swallows light. This is the story of Krubera Cave, the deepest cave ever measured, a vertical world beneath a mountain where earth becomes layered and time becomes heavy, and where the idea of down stops being a direction and starts being a commitment. Krubera lies in the Arabica Massif in the Western Caucasus, a rugged landscape of ridgelines and forests where the air can feel thin even when you're not at altitude. On the surface, it can look almost peaceful. Green slopes, misted valleys, stone outcrops bleached by weather. But karst landscapes have a habit of lying. Karst is what happens when water meets limestone and refuses to take no for an answer. Drop by drop, the rock dissolves. The ground hollows. Caverns interlock. Channels form like veins. And the result is a hidden architecture that doesn't resemble a tunnel system so much as a second world, one that has been under construction for hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. If you stand above a deep karst cave, you are standing over an absence, Not an empty space, but a space filled with darkness, water, stone, and forces so slow they're difficult to feel. The kind of forces that make a mountain into a sponge and turn gravity into a sculptor. For most of human history, that world was not explored. It was imagined. The deepest caves were not measured in meters, but in stories, openings that went on forever, shafts that never ended, places where voices came back wrong, or not at all. In many cultures, caves were treated as borders, between living and dead, between surface and underworld, between known land and whatever waits beneath it. Krubera is one of those places where the old instincts still make sense. Even now, even with modern equipment and trained teams, the cave resists us. It doesn't just challenge the body, it challenges the expectation that the planet is, at some point, comprehensible. Because Krubera isn't a simple descent, it's a layered descent. The earliest stages can feel deceptively familiar. Rock walls wet with condensation, air cooling as you move inward, passages narrowing, then opening. But quickly, the cave becomes vertical. Wells drop away beneath your boots. Narrow shafts fall into darkness. Ropes become lifelines, and every anchor point is a negotiation with stone. You don't walk into Krubera. You surrender to it, one rappel at a time. And the deeper you go, the more the cave changes its tone. The air grows colder and more stable, as if you've left weather behind and entered a climate that does not care about the surface. Water becomes constant, not just puddles, but streams, drips, curtains, invisible seepage that chills through gloves. The walls begin to show the long memory of flow. Scalloped stone carved by past floods. Polished surfaces where water once raced. Mud banks that suggest entire chambers can fill and empty like lungs. In caves this deep, water is not a feature. It is the architect. Teams descend in stages. They establish underground bivouacs, temporary camps in chambers where the ceiling sweats and the floor is stone. They eat in dim light. They sleep against rock. They wake to the same darkness. And then they go deeper, into passages that can suddenly tighten into squeezes or drop into pits where a mistake isn't dramatic. It's final. And then the moment arrives that turns deep from an idea into a fact. You are clipped into the rope, and the beam of your headlamp is the only sun you've brought with you. The passage drops away, and the sound of water isn't ahead or behind. It's everywhere, a steady, patient insistence that the mountain is still draining itself. You ease over the lip and begin to descend, boots skimming wet stone, harness biting as gravity takes hold. The light swings, and for a second, the void looks like nothing at all. Just blackness swallowing distance. Then the beam catches the wall. Smooth, scalloped limestone carved by floods you never saw. A cold draft slides past your face, steady and deep, as if the cave is breathing. Far below, your light can't find a floor. You hang in midair, suspended between rock and darkness, listening to the rope creak and the water whisper, and you understand, without needing a number, that the world you live in is only the roof of another world. Deep cave exploration is less like hiking and more like sustained survival. And the deeper you go, the more the cave changes its tone. This is why, even after decades of effort, deepest known point is a phrase with a shadow attached. Known is not the same as finished. Known is not the same as complete. And in a system like Krubera, the unknown isn't a dramatic void. It's a practical reality, a passage that hasn't been pushed, a side shaft that drops farther than expected, a submerged tunnel that might open into another world. or might simply close. In many deep caves, the limit is not stone, it's water. At a certain depth, water tables and underground rivers take control. Caves become conduits for entire watersheds. They drain mountains. They collect rainfall from kilometers away. They feed springs that emerge far from their source. And because water wants to go down, the deepest caves are often the ones that intersect the most powerful hidden plumbing on Earth. Krubera sits in a region where geology and climate conspire to make those plumbing systems extreme. Thick limestone, heavy precipitation, complex tectonics, a landscape fractured and folded, offering water 1,000 ways inward. The cave is not a single hole. It is a wound in the rock that keeps opening. And then there is the other mystery, one that feels quieter, but somehow more unsettling. Life. We tend to think of caves as dead places, empty, sterile, a realm of stone. But deep caves are not just voids, they are ecosystems. Sparse, fragile ecosystems. Yes, but ecosystems nonetheless. Microbes that feed on minerals. Tiny arthropods adapted to darkness. Life that survives without plants, without sunlight, sometimes without the kind of food web we expect to be necessary. In the deepest parts of caves, energy is a problem. There are no leaves, no algae, no photosynthesis. The cave exists on what the surface can send down, organic scraps washed in by water, or carried in by animals, or deposited over long time scales. And yet, even where those inputs become thin, life persists. That fact forces a larger question. If life can find a foothold here, cold, dark, pressurized, nutrient poor, then what does that say about the boundaries we imagine? Krubera is often described as a place that challenges our definition of terrestrial life. And it does, not because it contains monsters or anomalies, but because it contains endurance. It holds communities of organisms that don't just tolerate the underworld, they belong to it. The deeper you go, the more those organisms seem less like creatures and more like evidence of a principle, that life doesn't require comfort, it requires opportunity. That idea naturally invites speculation, even among careful scientists, because caves like Krubera are analogues, natural test chambers for other worlds. When people talk about the possibility of life beneath the surface of Mars or under the ice of Europa, they often point to places like this. If microbes can persist in deep, dark, mineral-rich environments on Earth, perhaps they could persist in similar environments elsewhere. And that's where Krubera becomes strangely cosmic. A hole in a Caucasus mountain becomes a rehearsal for alien worlds. But Krubera's mysteries don't stop at biology. The cave also acts like a recorder, an archive of the Earth's behavior layered into stone. Every stalactite and stalagmite is a history of dripping water, year after year, with chemical signatures that can reveal shifts in climate. Every flowstone sheet is a record of water movement, a fossilized stream. Even the mud can preserve evidence of past floods, of storm cycles, of ancient shifts in hydrology. In that sense, Krubera is not only deep in space, it is deep in time. And yet, despite all of this, despite the years of exploration, the surveys, the measurements, Krubera keeps one last trick. It refuses to feel fully claimed. Part of that is because it exists in a region with a complicated human reality. Political borders, disputed territories, remote mountain conditions. Logistics are difficult. Access can be uncertain. But even if the surface world were simple and calm, the cave itself would remain what it is, a system that punishes certainty. The deeper systems are not only physically hostile, they are structurally elusive. When explorers speak of deep caves, They often speak about the next push, the next expedition, the next attempt to connect a side passage, the next sump to dive, the next lead to follow. In Krubera, those leads can feel endless because the cave behaves less like a single achievement and more like a living labyrinth. Every new depth measurement feels like a chapter, not a conclusion. And beneath that is a question that isn't always asked out loud because it sounds almost childish, almost mythic. Is it possible that the cave goes even deeper? Not in the sense of breaking a record for the sake of pride, but in the sense that there may be a deeper architecture below, hidden behind a choke, or sealed behind an underwater passage, or collapsed in a way that still allows water, and only water, to pass. In karst systems, deeper connections can exist beyond human reach. Water can pass through cracks too tight for a body. Entire flooded conduits can run beneath our known endpoints. The known cave can be only the dry scaffolding around a deeper river system. And Krubera, with its extreme verticality and powerful flow, has always hinted at something beyond. Some theories focus on the cave's hydrology, that the cave may connect, through submerged routes, to distant springs and the Black Sea coastline, implying complex pathways that could extend the cave's effective depth beyond what a human can travel. Others look to the massif itself, its fractures and fault systems, and suggest that what we call Krubera might be only one open door into a larger underground network. The most grounded view says this: deep caves are never truly finished. They are discovered in the same way coastlines were once discovered, slowly, with gaps on maps that shrink over decades, not months. A cave can remain deepest known, not because it has reached its end, but because it has reached the end of what our bodies and gear can currently tolerate. And that line between geological reality and human limitation is exactly where the mystery lives. Because the cave doesn't care about records. It doesn't care about being the deepest. It doesn't care about being measured. It doesn't even care about being entered. It exists in its own slow rhythm. Water dissolving rock, stone collapsing, passages opening, others sealing. A machine made of gravity and time, running in darkness, indifferent to our maps. And there is something quietly disturbing about that. When people describe a place like Krubera, they often use the language of conquest: pushed, reached, penetrated, achieved. But the reality is the opposite. The cave allows entry. The cave permits travel. And the cave can revoke that permission at any moment, with a storm on the surface, a rise in water, a shift in debris. In that sense, Krubera is not a trophy. It's a reminder that beneath the earth we stand on, beneath roads and cities and grasslands arranged in perfect circles, there are systems that will never be entirely domesticated. Places that can be studied, yes, and respected, yes, and even visited, but not fully owned by understanding. And perhaps that is why deep caves feel so haunting, even without legends. Because in a cave like Krubera, the darkness isn't theatrical, it's functional. It is the absence that allows the mountain to keep its secrets. Somewhere down there, beyond the deepest surveyed point, water continues to move through stone in routes we cannot follow. Microbes continue to exist in pockets of mineral-rich damp, living without sunlight, without seasons, without names. And new collapses will shape new passages long after our ropes have frayed into dust. On the surface, the world rearranges itself into circles we struggle to explain. Below, the world rearranges itself into corridors and shafts so deep they change what Earth feels like as a concept. And if you listen closely, If you imagine the mountain as a living thing, you can almost hear it. The drip that becomes a stream, the stream that becomes a siphon, the siphon that becomes a river, and the river vanishing into a deeper dark no human has ever seen. The cave is still there, still descending, still unfinished. And the most unsettling possibility is not that something waits at the bottom, but that there may not be a bottom in any way we can reach. Only a continuing plunge, stone to water, water to stone, an endless architecture of downward passages, quietly being built, quietly being erased, as if the earth itself is still digging, and we are only standing at the entrance, pretending we understand what deep really means. Story 5. The Mountains That Vanish. If the deepest caves on Earth remind us that the planet is still hiding whole worlds beneath our feet, then some mysteries feel stranger still, because they do not lie at the bottom of an abyss, but out in the open, exposed to wind and salt and sunlight, as if daring us to explain them. Far from the flooded shafts of Krubera, on a cold and lonely stretch of the Qinghai Plateau in western China, a pale mountain rises beside a mineral lake. Its slopes are barren, its air is thin, and from its rock, as though from the remains of something buried and broken, protrude formations that look disturbingly familiar. Not crystals, not roots, at least not at first glance, but pipes. Long, rust-colored, hollow-looking tubes emerging from stone and reaching toward the shore of nearby Tuosu Lake, not far from Delinga in Qinghai's Haixi prefecture. Some are narrow as reeds, others are said to be much wider, and for years they have inspired a question that refuses to settle. Are the bygone pipes merely one of geology's strangest illusions, or traces of a system built so long ago that history itself has forgotten it? The landscape around Mount Baigong does not soften the mystery. This is not lush country. It is severe, high, dry, and quiet. A place where distance seems to stretch and sound seems to thin out before it reaches you. The mountain stands near Tuosu, sometimes rendered Toson, a salt lake whose still surface reflects a sky so wide it can make the land feel abandoned. Reports describe 3 caves in the mountain face. 2 are collapsed. The third, the largest, remains accessible, its opening large enough to suggest, at least to an imaginative eye, not just a cave, but an entrance. Early accounts in state media described the site in almost theatrical terms. A mountain cave, pipe-like structures in its walls, and more of the same formations scattered along the lakeshore and even beneath the waterline. It was exactly the kind of setting that turns uncertainty into legend, because when something already looks impossible, the human mind seldom reaches first for the ordinary explanation. The wider world did not hear much about Baigong until the early 2000s, when Chinese media reports pushed the site into public fascination. By then, stories were already circulating that the formations had first been noticed years earlier, possibly in the 1990s, after visiting researchers or fossil hunters drew attention to them. What mattered more than the exact moment of discovery was the image that followed. Pipe-like objects protruding from bedrock in a region with no obvious ancient industrial history, no known buried factory, and no accepted archaeological context for such a thing. One report described a thick pipe around the cave entrance, with narrower ones trailing down toward the lake, as though they had once fed or drained something. Another noted fragments on the shore that looked like rusted scrap. In a place already so remote that it felt half separated from the modern world, the visual language of the site did the rest. A mountain, a hidden cave, iron-like tubes, a salt lake. It was not difficult for people to start seeing infrastructure where nature may only have produced coincidence. And once that idea took hold, speculation expanded quickly. Some people proposed that the formations were the remains of an ancient water delivery system laid down by a forgotten culture in a time before the region became so desolate. Others drifted further into fringe territory and suggested prehistoric industry, lost civilizations, or even relics of extraterrestrial visitation. The site was at one point openly marketed in sensational language as an ET relic area, and that branding only deepened the divide between curiosity and credibility. It is easy to dismiss such claims now, but part of the Baigong Pipe's staying power comes from the fact that they seem to exploit a weakness in human perception. When stone imitates design, we instinctively treat it as evidence of intention. A straight line in nature feels suspicious. A circular opening feels planned. A cluster of tube-like forms aimed in the same general direction begins to feel less like geology and more like debris from a vanished purpose. For a time, even the material descriptions added to the intrigue. Samples examined locally were reported to contain large amounts of iron oxide, along with silica and calcium oxide. Hardly the kind of chemistry that proves artificial manufacture, but enough to preserve the popular image of iron pipes lodged in rock. That phrase alone did enormous cultural work. Iron pipes suggest metallurgy, engineering, extraction, transport. They suggest furnaces and tools and hands. Yet chemistry on its own can be deceptive. Many natural processes produce iron-rich materials, and iron is one of the most common elements involved in the staining, cementing, and replacement of rock and organic remains. The question was never simply whether iron was present. The question was why it had gathered in shapes so suggestive of architecture. The mainstream geological explanation is less cinematic, but in some ways more unsettling because of how casually it allows nature to mimic intelligence. According to accounts summarized by later references, Chinese investigators came to favor the idea that at least many of the pipes were natural formations, possibly mineralized or fossilized tree roots or root casts preserved through long geologic change. In this scenario, ancient vegetation once grew in a very different environment from the dry plateau seen today. Over time, roots were buried by sediment. Mineral-rich groundwater moved through the buried material. Organic tissue decayed, but the spaces it left behind became filled or outlined by iron-bearing minerals and other natural cements. What remained after compression, uplift, erosion, and exposure could look strikingly like tubes embedded in stone. In some reports, investigators even claimed to have found organic plant matter and tree ring-like patterns in sections of the formations, reinforcing the root cast theory. It is an explanation that strips the site of its engineered romance, but replaces it with something equally uncanny. The possibility that the mountain is preserving the ghost shapes of a vanished landscape, a fossil memory of roots mistaken for pipes because the Earth sometimes remembers biology in the language of machinery. And yet, the natural explanation has never fully satisfied everyone who looks at the site. Part of that is because the Baigong pipes are not a single neat specimen in a lab. They are a scatter of forms, reports, photos, fragments, and local descriptions accumulated over years. Some appear convincingly root-like. Others, at least in images and retellings, seem strangely rigid, oddly placed, or improbably clean in cross-section. The remoteness of the site has also helped preserve its ambiguity. This is not a famous ruin with decades of transparent peer-reviewed excavation. It remains more like a contested curiosity, half tourist oddity, half case study in how mysteries are built. When data is thin, photographs are selective, and media coverage has already framed the place as anomalous, each new viewer arrives half prepared to see something impossible. The eye begins interpreting erosion as craftsmanship and absence of certainty as evidence of suppression. That is often how modern myths survive. Not because proof is strong, but because context is weak enough to let the imagination keep working. There is also the question of age, one of the details most often inflated in retellings. Popular versions of the story sometimes claim the formations are impossibly old, older than any plausible human construction in the region, which paradoxically pushes believers away from archaeology and toward prehistory, advanced lost cultures, or alien intervention. But age claims in mystery stories often harden before the underlying methods are clearly presented to the public. Dates become headlines, headlines become legend, and legend becomes the thing people remember long after the supporting detail has thinned away. The bygone pipes sit in exactly that dangerous zone where a real place, a real anomaly, and uncertain dating claims can combine into something more durable than evidence: atmosphere. And atmosphere, especially in lonely terrain, can be more persuasive than science to the part of the mind that wants the world to be hiding one more impossible thing. Still, even if we grant the geological case its full weight, the mystery does not entirely disappear. It only changes shape. Because then, the real question becomes not who built the pipes, but why nature so often seems capable of producing forms that resemble intention. Why do mineral processes create cylinders, veins, channels, lattices, and branching systems that look uncannily designed? Why do fossil roots, concretions, and iron-rich replacements so easily masquerade as tools, conduits, and ruins? The answer, perhaps, is that both biology and geology are systems of flow. Water seeks paths. Roots seek moisture. Minerals precipitate along boundaries. Over enough time, the Earth learns to build structure out of repetition. Tubes are efficient. Branching is efficient. Hollow channels are efficient. What looks engineered may simply be what matter does, again and again, under pressure, heat, chemistry, and time. But knowing that does not necessarily make the site less eerie. In fact, it may deepen it, because then the mountain is not hiding a lost machine. It is behaving like one. And that is what gives the bygone pipes their peculiar power in the imagination. They exist on a threshold between categories we prefer to keep separate: natural and artificial, fossil and artifact, landscape and ruin. They remind us how fragile those distinctions can become in places where evidence is incomplete and time has had too long to work. An archaeologist may see a geological mimic. A tourist may see buried technology. A local guide may see a site transformed by myth into livelihood. A conspiracist may see censorship. A geologist may see iron-rich replacement tracing old plant structures in stone. The mountain offers no final correction. It simply keeps the forms in place and lets each visitor bring an explanation to them. In that sense, the real mystery is not only in the pipes themselves, but in the way human perception locks onto pattern and purpose, even when standing before processes far older and less personal than any civilization. Imagine standing there in the thin air beside Tuosu Lake, the water pale and still, the slopes of Baigong Mountain almost colorless under a high plateau sky. There is very little to soften the scene. No dense forest, no crowd, no surrounding monument complex to tell you what you're looking at. Just rock, salt, silence, and those protruding forms, some broken, some embedded, some leading nowhere you can follow. If you arrived with no explanation at all, you might feel what so many mysteries rely on. That brief, unstable moment before knowledge settles, when the mind hovers between recognition and disbelief. They look like pipes. They may not be pipes. They may be root casts, mineral intrusions, iron-cemented traces of a world that existed before the plateau became what it is now. And yet the resemblance remains. The lake remains. The cave remains. The mountain remains. And in that barren place, the boundary between ancient environment and ancient construction becomes thin enough to almost disappear. Perhaps that is why the Baigong pipes endure. Not because they prove something extraordinary, but because they expose how little certainty is required for wonder to survive. A few shapes in stone, a remote mountain, a salt lake, conflicting explanations, sensational headlines, quiet scientific rebuttals, and beneath all of it, a more haunting possibility. That the Earth can generate forms so suggestive of intelligence that we begin inventing lost builders simply to avoid admitting how strange nature already is. So the question lingers in the dry air of Western China. Were these once part of a system planned by minds now erased from record? Or are they the remnants of roots, minerals, and time, arranged by blind processes into something that only resembles memory? At Mount Baigong, the stone does not answer. It only protrudes from the mountain in rust-colored lines, pointing toward the lake like unfinished sentences, as if something beneath the surface was trying to connect one silence to another, and stopped just before explaining why. The world is still filled with places that resist explanation. Some lie at the bottom of silent seas, where lost ships remain untouched by time. Others cling to impossible cliffs carved high into the mountains, as if they were never meant to be reached at all. Some appear as perfect patterns in the earth, too precise, too consistent to fully explain, and others descend so far beneath the surface that even now, we have not seen where they truly end. And then, there are the places where stone itself seems to hold a secret, where strange formations blur the line between geology and something far more unsettling. The stories we explored here are reminders that even in the modern world, there are still corners of this planet that remain mysterious, debated, and deeply unknown. If you enjoyed this journey into some of Earth's most unexplained places, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos for more real mysteries hidden across the world. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, stay safe.